Hello, all, and welcome to the very first episode of Muddy York. As we said in the opener, I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. Adam and I created this podcast because we were interested in the history of Toronto and really couldn't find any podcasts about that history. There are plenty of podcasts about American cities like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, but nothing for TO. So we decided to fill that gap.
Muddy York was an old nickname for Toronto. It used to be the town of York, and during wet weather, the York streets would become seas of mud. There's an old joke about a Toronto man walking down the road when he sees a fine hat lying in the street. When he stops to pick it up, he discovers the head of its owner almost submerged in the mud. This poor man asks for help, not just for himself, but for the horse he's sitting on.
Adam and I both grew up in the GTA, so we'll try to be your guides on this tour through the wonderful world of Toronto history.
Now, Gray and I had a long debate about what our first episode should be about, but it turns out that John Tory made the decision for us. In honor of the 2023 mayoral election, Muddy York's first episode will be about Toronto's very first election. It took place 223 years ago in the year 1800, at a time when Toronto was still the village of York.
Okay, so if York wasn't Toronto yet, was it even Ontario?
This was the British province of Upper Canada. Toronto's city government was run by the Home District Council, and council members were all appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, who was the most powerful man in town. The only elected officials in Upper Canada were the members of the Provincial Legislative Assembly. Until 1800, the people of York were represented by the member for Durham, York, and the First Riding of Lincoln, a constituency that ran from what is now Port Hope in the east, all the way to Kitchener-Waterloo in the west.
That is massive. So I grew up in North Toronto, the city of York. So you're saying that my representative would not only be managing downtown, but that far east and that far west as well? This seems like a pretty ineffective way of doing things, no?
Well, there were a lot fewer people to represent back then. In 1800, the new constituency of Durham, Simcoe, and the East Riding of York was created, with the election poll to be held right here in the center of York. A man writing under the pseudonym of Cato in the Upper Canada Gazette, the only newspaper in town at that time, described the sort of man who should be elected. Nothing can be more true than that the primary wish of every elector is to see himself represented in his country's legislature by an honest, upright man. Honest and upright indeed ought that man to be who is entrusted with so high a charge, gentlemen, of such magnitude and so sacred that no one should assume it without mature examination of the eventful and interminable consequences. A solemn and unprejudiced review of the duties incumbent on the representative of the powers vested in the hand of the many whose rights he binds himself to support should, methinks, deter the unwary from aiming for it, and the unequal to wishing it, should establish this prominent, though neglected truth, that something more than plebeian honesty, than rugged uprightness is necessary to qualify an individual for the dignified station, a station, gentlemen, to which is attached duties so various and so sacred, so extensive and so complicated, that he who has just a sense of them will not enter on their discharge, but with conscious fear and trembling.
Okay, so were there any men in York who thought they had the plebeian honesty and rugged uprightness attached to the sacred duties for this job?
Why, yes.
Oh.
4 men chose to stand for this office. They were Henry Alcock, Samuel Heron, John Small, and William Jarvis. Henry Alcock was a lawyer from London, England, because there was no London, Ontario. He moved to York when he was appointed to be a judge for the highest court in Upper Canada. He arrived in 1799, just 1 year before the election, and by all accounts, he was very difficult to work with.
He sounds like the kind of person that you want representing you. Parachutes in a year before the election, and he's not very nice?
Well, no one had lived in York for more than 7 years, And in some ways, he was exactly the kind of person who was willing to move there in those days. Remember, ordinary people practicing law in the capital of the British Empire do not move to 6-year-old villages in the middle of nowhere. You had to be willing to march to your own drummer, and Pioneer York attracted plenty of misfits and troublemakers, even when they were called Your Honor. John Small, candidate number 2, came to Canada when he was appointed clerk of the Executive Council of Upper Canada. He was a political appointee, and by most accounts, he wasn't very good at his job. But his political connections meant that he kept his position. At election time, he was best known for a duel in which he had killed a man, but not just any man. John Small had killed the Attorney General for Upper Canada, a man named John White. Apparently, Mrs. Small had snubbed Mrs. White. Mr. White reacted by writing a letter questioning the legality of Small's marriage. Small challenged White to a duel and mortally wounded him.
As the youth say, that escalated quickly. This is, really dramatic, no?
Well, people in those days were obsessed with notions of honor. They really would duel over minor social slights. Small was indicted for murder, but he was acquitted at trial. Even though dueling was illegal, a man who killed his opponent in an honorable duel would usually be acquitted by a local jury. Incidentally, the judge at his trial was Justice Henry Alcock, and the foreman of the jury was William Jarvis, the third candidate in this election.
Small town in those days.
William Jarvis, the namesake for Jarvis Street, was one of the United Empire Loyalists who fled the United States after the American Revolution. During the war, he fought in the Queen's Rangers, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, who would become the first governor of Upper Canada and will undoubtedly be the subject of a future episode. After the war ended, he traveled to Britain, and Simcoe helped him secure a position as provincial secretary and registrar for Upper Canada. By all accounts, he also wasn't very good at his job, and at one point, the lieutenant governor actually censured him for sloppy work. Nonetheless, Jarvis was part of Upper Canada's governing elite, what would come to be known as the Family Compact. Simcoe named him Deputy Lieutenant for the County of York. County lieutenants were supposed to be a sort of Canadian aristocracy, defending the British class system. He was also Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge of Upper Canada, so he may have secretly controlled the Canadian government. Jarvis was known for being, let's say, temperamental. When some of his colleagues suspected him of writing an anonymous pamphlet criticizing them, he decided that the best way to resolve the situation was by challenging all 4 of them to a duel.
So this guy is clearly no good. Why don't you tell people why they want to rename Jarvis Street?
Jarvis was also an ardent slaveholder, and he led the opposition to Governor Simcoe's attempt to abolish slavery in Upper Canada. Eventually, Simcoe had to agree to a compromise plan that banned the importation of slaves and emancipated children born to slaves once they turned 25, but obviously something short of the immediate emancipation that abolitionists were seeking. Samuel Heron was the last candidate. He was a prominent local businessman who opened one of the first general stores in York. Heron ran as the man of the people because Alcock, Jarvis, and Small all held paid positions in the colonial government. An article supporting Heron in the Upper Canada Gazette, written by, quote, a farmer, said that the man elected should, neither directly or indirectly, receive any emoluments from or an office under government. This was a fancy way of saying that the elected official shouldn't be getting paid by government on the side. Admitting that Heron lacked a refined education, the writer argued that he was an honest, upright, and just man. Cato, from our earlier quote, didn't take kindly to a farmer's opinion, and in a future issue, he described a farmer's writing as the idle, nefarious belchings of an assuming ignoramus. Now, say what you will about people in those days, but they put far more effort into their insults than we do now.
It's a burn. I bet you it's still stinging in 2023. Now, elections in 1800 were very different from today. For one thing, there was no secret ballot. Voters were supposed to proudly declare their choice for all to hear. For another, voting rights were very restricted. Only men were allowed to vote. Women were obviously, according to them, emotional. They're too emotional to make such an important decision, and only men made decisions based on pure logic and reason. We all know that that's not true. There were property qualifications, meaning that you had to own a certain amount of property or pay a certain amount in taxes to vote. You also had to swear an oath of allegiance to the British crown. People like the Quakers or Mennonites who refused to swear oaths were not allowed to vote. Neither were Jewish people because the oath included a commitment to the Christian faith. On election day, representatives for the different candidates were allowed to challenge the qualifications of voters who they thought were ineligible, or more likely, who they thought would vote against their candidate. Political campaigns were raucous affairs, and violence at polling places wasn't unusual as different groups of supporters fought with each other or tried to keep their opponents from voting. Candidates routinely bribed voters with food and drink. That could become a problem if voters got drunk and forgot what they were supposed to be doing or who they were supposed to be voting for in an election. There were no political parties, but candidates would be unofficially associated with either the government or the opposition. There was only one polling place, at the government buildings in York, so voters from across the riding had to travel there if they ever wanted to vote. This gave the government an advantage because York was the provincial capital and had a solid block of government supporters who could walk to the poll, while opposition supporters tended to live in the surrounding regions and had to travel a long distance to vote for their candidate.
So the government was trying to suppress opposition voters.
Well, it looks like it, but they didn't really stop people from voting. They just happened to place the one and only poll in the town where they had the most support.
Well, that's convenient.
In this election, the polls would be open for 2 days. Things went smoothly on day one, and when the polls closed, Henry Alcock and Samuel Heron were leading the other two candidates. The problems began on day two. It seems to have started when a group of soldiers arrived to cast their votes. A drunken bystander at the polls protested that they were ineligible. Alcock believed that they were planning to vote for him, so he threatened the objector and demanded that the constables arrest him, which they duly did. However, most of the crowd sided with the arrested men, and a brawl ensued. Alcock's representatives, one William Weeks, was keeping track of the votes and realized that Alcock was ahead by 2. In the commotion, he convinced the election officer to close the poll and declare the election over. Heron tried to protest, but was shouted down by Weeks. Constables read the riot act and forced the crowd to disperse. According to the Upper Canada Gazette, the poll for the election of a member to serve in Parliament for the East Riding of York was closed yesterday when Henry Alcock Esquire was declared to be duly elected. The election terminated sooner than expected by consequences of a daring riot instigated by persons inimical, I always get that wrong, to peace and good order, and to pure exercise of the value privilege of the subject, the elective franchise. That's a mouthful.
It's actually a very polite way of describing what was a drunken brawl.
I understand what that is. Okay. A large number of people didn't see it that way. Heron and 97 others petitioned for a new vote on the grounds that very unwarrantable steps had been taken by the friends of Mr. Alcock to ensure that he was elected. The Legislative Assembly agreed and ordered a new election in 1801. Alcock didn't take it well, declaring that he wouldn't lead the assembly unless they throw me out neck and heels.
Now, is there a headline that says Alcock thrown out of assembly by neck and heels?
Unfortunately, no, or we couldn't find one at least. Alcock, Heron, and Jarvis all decided to sit out the by-election. The main candidate was Angus MacDonald, who had been Heron's representative during the first election and wrote the petition protesting the result. On election day 1801, he defeated John Small with 112 votes to 32, making Angus MacDonald the first person officially elected from Toronto. There were no reports of any riots around this time.
And that was the very first episode of Muddy York. So, Gray, how do you feel we did?
I mean, I think we did okay. I think that if you stuck around this long, we appreciate you for listening to us, and we'll keep getting better. Feel free to let us know about any great Toronto resources to help us keep our research up to date. Please feel free to subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews, and feel free to shoot us your comments and questions at muddyyork@outlook.com. So that's muddy_york@outlook.com. Or you can follow us on Twitter at Toronto_history. This, guys, is a work in progress, and we'll be continually working on it, bringing great information and using the best resources we can find. I know that Adam and I are working on this project and just want to make it great for you guys. So feel free to reach out. Any suggestions, we'll keep improving. We hope you keep listening.
Our next episode will be about the escaped slaves who created the very first taxi cab in Toronto. We'll see you then.